Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. I'm Lando, and this is part of the Native Oak collaboration focusing on the fact that history matters and myths aren't all they're cracked up to be. Speaking of myths, there's one particular one I want to talk about in this video, and that is the idea that is fairly common, you may have heard of it, that the British conquered India because the Indians were bad at fighting. This is actually quite an old myth. It dates back to the time of the British Empire itself, and it grew out of the truth that smaller amounts of better equipped British paid soldiers could defeat larger armies of the Indian powers, the so-called country powers as they were called at the time. This grew into an idea of racial superiority, of martial superiority in a European context. Europeans felt that they were better soldiers, they were naturally more suited to fighting, they were more intelligent, they were craftier, they were just overall superior, and the only way that Indian forces could stand up to them was if there was a large amount of European officers in those forces. This video is all about times when that logic just doesn't work. And the British, at the height of their powers, get royally thrashed. So I hope you're all looking forward to that. Please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content, and be sure to check out the rest of the videos in the playlist to find out why history matters even more than it does with this video. So the first example I'm going to talk about is the Battle of Wadgaon, which occurred in 1779. So, backtracking a little, in 1775, the British and Maratha politics accidentally collided. Raghunath Rao Peshwa, who had recently came to power in a murderous coup, was forced to flee his new kingdom and asked the British for help. Though Governor-General Warren Hastings promised military support, the British government had passed the Regulating Act just around the same time, an act which curtailed, or as the name suggests, tried to regulate expansion in India. And in light of this, a new treaty was signed offering asylum to Raghunath Rao, but no military support. This happened in 1776. The problem was that the Governor-General had only recently been given powers over the other presidencies, and both the Presidency of Bombay and the Senior Council of Bengal disagreed with the New Deal. And not only that, but authorized an expedition to march on the Maratha capital of Pune to sort things out and restore Raghunath Rao rather than risk his enemies siding with the French, who were, getting along in hating the British at this time. So in late 1776, a force of between 2,000 to 4,000 British troops, mostly from Bombay, and most of whom were sepoys, marched through the mountains and towards the Maratha capital. Maratha generals, such as Mahadaji Scindia, and the leader of the so-called Brahmin government, Nana Fadnavis, who had unseated Raghunath Rao, were determined to fight. Now the British found that the area they were marching through was in drought, and they were to be harassed by Maratha light cavalry every step of the way. In fact, they were only a day's march from Pune when a council of war elected to retreat, fearing that their supply line would be cut and their food and ammunition would run out before they could do anything. So the heavy guns were pushed into a convenient pool of water, and they retreated. But the small force was still too slow and became blockaded in a small town called Wadgaon on or about the 12th of January 1777. Repeated Maratha attacks were driven off from this position, but it was clear that the British were trapped, and the civilian and military commanders elected to ask for terms. The British surrendered on the 16th of January and were generously allowed to go back to Bombay, as long as they promised that all British forces would retreat and land concessions would be given. Now, of course, Warren Hastings rejected the treaty, as Bombay had neither the authority to invade the Maratha Empire nor sign a treaty. And actually a small force from Bengal had rescued some British pride shortly thereafter, but this was a signal defeat that could have resulted in the outright destruction of a well-equipped British expedition on the cusp of France declaring war in support of the British colonies in America. So example 2, moving on, is what I call the Great War of Hyder Ali. Outraged by the bad faith of the East India Company and their attacks on his dependencies, the Sultan of Mysore, Hyder Ali, coerced and organized a coalition of the great powers of India and invaded the Carnatic with a massive army. Incredulous that anyone could form such a powerful league against them, the British hesitated until it was almost too late. Without a fully modern army or unified purpose amongst his allies, Hyder fought a brilliant campaign with total freedom of movement and complete awareness of his enemy's inactivity. He moved on Arcot in the summer. General Monroe moved his army towards Kanchipuram in hopes of securing supplies and linking up with Colonel Bally's 2,150 men who were marching towards Madras. This move drew Hyder to Kanchipuram as well, and here the Sultan gained a central position between the two British forces. He besieged Arcot, contained Monroe, and sent his son Tipu to wipe out Bally's detachment, which he did convincingly amidst much slaughter and rocket fire on between the 9th and the 10th of September at Polilur. Now, Colonel Bally surrendered with a handful of Europeans and was imprisoned in the Srirangapatana, and this battle, in which Hyder's son Tipu commanded, was deemed one of the most disastrous defeats in the British experience in India. Arcot was stormed in October, and had not the advancing rains made campaigning difficult, Madras might itself have come under siege. Now, although to begin with it seemed like every Indian power was in arms against the company, the Marathas and the Hyderabadis, for instance, had many grudges against Mysore. For instance, the Marathas under Nana Fadnavis and Mahadaji Scindia had no faith in the campaign and hoped to take a chunk of land from Hyder's kingdom. Hastings leapt on this. He was so desperate to break the coalition that when the Treaty of Salbai was signed in 1782, he surrendered practically everything attained through the auspices of the ex-Peshwa Raghunath Rao, but the port of Bassein, which was an old Portuguese trading base on the Indian Ocean. With the somewhat loose coalition now cut in half, Hastings sent General Sir R. Coote to Madras with reinforcements to deal with Hyder. This was a military duel that in its complexity is worthy to stand beside those of Lee and Grant or Monty and Rommel. In 3 direct confrontations in 1781, both men left the field bruised but basically able to continue the fight. Coote and Hyder's duel therefore more or less ended with moderate British success, but truly ended when both men dropped dead before the war even ended. The Second Mysore War did drag onwards into 1784, however, thanks to the obstinacy of Hyder's son Tipu, later known as the Tiger of Mysore, and ended with a status quo treaty that made Tipu the last Indian ruler to dictate a peace treaty, that of Mangalore, to the British. It tasted bitter to many in Bengal and London, and it made Mysore the great enemy of the East India Company. Now, with those two in mind, we go to example 3, so buckle up. Example 3 is Monson's Retreat and Bharatpur, so you're getting 2 for 1, but it's hard to separate the two when you get going. Defeats like Wat Gaon and Polilur were troubling to look back on, but some hoped that after Tipu was killed in 1799, these unpleasant events could be put behind them. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. Towards the end of the Second Maratha War, which had been going quite well, in 1804, after capturing Delhi and defeating the Marathas at Laswari, Lord Lake had left a strong force of approximately 3,000 to 4,000 sepoys and about 3,500 irregular cavalry to guard the Rajasthan frontier, while he took the main army back into Hindustan, thinking that the war was over. Also wrong. The only Maratha general left in the field was Yashwantrao Holkar, the young, one-eyed, hard-drinking, hard-riding bastard son of the last Maharaja of Indore, and Lake thought that as the other Maratha confederates had been defeated and Holkar was devoid of allies, he would just slink away and never be heard of again. The commander of the Corps of Observation, Colonel Monson, however, was determined to put an end to Holkar and pressed into Rajasthan only to find that his enemy was advancing upon him with a mostly mounted army of numberless proportions. So low on food, equipment and allies, and in increasingly bad weather, Monson began a disastrous retreat back to Agra, barely keeping his force together as Holkar's cavalry whittled it away at every mountain pass and river crossing, capturing prisoners, flags and cannons until the entire force broke in disorder and fled to the safety of the nearest towns. When what was left of the detachment reached Agra, the stragglers were mocked and jeered, and even the low-caste beggars who lived outside the walls pelted them with stones and probably other stuff. Monson escaped and was forgiven, but Lake was despondent at the loss of men and prestige. It was reported as the greatest defeat and shame of British arms yet seen in India, even worse than those seen in the war with Mysore. Equally troubling was the threat of defection, however. Already the Raja of Bharatpur, the capital of the Jat kingdom, had sided with Holkar, having submitted to the British already when things were going their way. Sure that a massive reversal of fortune was about to occur as Holkar now besieged Delhi, Lord Lake had to grab whatever troops he had not sent away and rushed to relieve the city. He then chased Holkar south towards Agra before turning to exact a personal revenge, basically, on Bharatpur. Lake's troops successfully stormed the fortress of Deeg, and despite being quite a small army with limited ammunition and artillery, they then laid siege to Bharatpur in early 1805, expecting swift success once the giant walls were breached, as the British had never failed to take a city in India by assault. However, in February, the British were still in their siege lines, having failed 4 times to take the walls, losing over 3,000 men in the process, and Lake was forced to agree to let the Raja pay an indemnity, and marched away to once again give chase to Holkar rather than risk yet more failures. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we should wrap up, because these are some of the more dramatic examples of the British losing in India on a fairly even playing field. Now, they were successful in South Asia, but it was hardly a walkover, in which their enemies stood no chance. One British officer said basically that if you can fight in India successfully, you can fight anywhere successfully. And let us not forget the East India Company army itself was predominantly an Indian army by 1800. The idea that the British took over India because Indians could not fight or were martially inferior to Europeans is an absurd hangover from the past. The reasons for British success in Asia is another video, as is the Indian military revolution of the 18th century, which is another major blow to the idea that Indian armies were all old-fashioned and disorganized. But I hope these examples have shown that despite the myth of British invincibility, in the end, when it came down to it, that is all it was. A convenient, comforting 19th century myth. Thank you for watching. Please continue through the playlist and check out the other videos. They're all great stuff. Thank you to Brandon F. and the Native Oak, and I will see you again for another adventure in Historyland the next time.